The shuttle hit the docking clamp so hard that Marcus Vale's teeth clicked together, and he tasted blood. He sat in the diplomatic pod for 11 seconds before moving. That was a habit left over from his years on the outer survey teams. 11 seconds to assess before you touched anything, because the thing you reached for first was usually the thing that killed you. He ran his tongue over his lip, confirmed the blood was his own and not the result of a pressure breach, and then checked the porthole. The sovereign ring of Velthon hung around him like a cathedral that had swallowed a city, that had swallowed a moon. It was the largest structure in the Dominion, 500 kilometers of spiraling white alloy, spinning slowly against a violet nebula, home to 40 million Vel, and the seat of a civilization that had ruled this arm of the galaxy for 11,000 years. They had built it before humanity had invented the wheel. Marcus unstrapped himself and stood up. He was 34 years old, medium height, brown hair going gray at the temples earlier than he'd have liked. He had a slight scar along his jaw from a mining accident on Kepler 442b 7 years ago. He had calloused hands and a habit of humming under his breath when he was working through a problem, which his ex-wife had found endearing and then, later, maddening. He was also, as of 40 minutes ago, the husband-elect of her sovereign radiance, Princess Elindra Velthesin Morvi, first daughter of the Dominion seat, inheritor of the eternal mandate. He had not been asked. The Dominion had not asked. They had sent a treaty document 43 pages long, drafted in Vel script so formal that the translation software had flagged 16 phrases as potentially archaic ceremonial language without modern equivalent. The treaty contained one human signature line. The signature line did not have a name printed above it, just a blank space and a seal that meant, in the oldest dialect of Vel, something close to, "The one we have chosen will sign here." Earth's government had sent Marcus because he spoke 4 Vel dialects, had spent more time in Dominion space than any other human diplomat, and because the alternative, as the Secretary General had explained with the careful calm of someone trying not to say the quiet part out loud, was war. The Dominion had not threatened war directly. They had simply listed, in an appendix to the treaty, the 17 human colonies that currently operated within their territorial sphere. And then they had listed the treaties protecting those colonies. And then they had noted that treaties required both parties to remain in good standing. It was the most polite threat Marcus had ever received. He straightened his jacket, the formal diplomatic gray, with the pale blue piping at the collar that indicated senior rank, picked up his single bag and walked to the airlock. The door opened onto a corridor of white stone that was not stone. It was some Vel composite that had a texture like marble and a faint luminescence that shifted from pale gold to silver depending on the angle. 4 members of the Vel Honor Guard waited for him. They were tall. Vel were always tall, 7 feet or more, with that particular stillness they had, like standing water that might at any moment become a current. Their ceremonial armor was layered in overlapping plates the color of deep water, and their eyes, all 4 of them, were fixed on Marcus with an expression he had learned to read in his years working with Vel. It was not hostility, it was assessment. They were looking at him the way you look at something you've just found in a trap, trying to determine whether it's dangerous or merely inconvenient. "Ambassador Vale," the lead guard said. The honorific was technically correct. He'd been bumped to ambassador for this trip, a promotion that came with exactly 0 additional resources and one very significant additional complication. Her radiance awaits. "Of course she does," Marcus said pleasantly. "Lead the way." He followed them through corridors that got progressively more elaborate. First the functional white composite passages of the docking ring, then wider halls where the walls were carved with the genealogies of the Vel ruling houses. Then finally the great open spaces of the inner court, where the ceiling was 50 meters above them, and the light fell in columns through apertures designed to track the nearest star. Marcus had been in the inner court once before, 6 years ago, as part of a trade delegation. He remembered thinking it was the most beautiful place he had ever stood. He still thought so. He also noted as he walked the placement of the guard stations, the camera positions, the spacing between the great carved pillars. Old habits. His survey team had worked some hostile environments. The princess was waiting in the court of first meeting. He had seen images, of course. Everyone had seen images of Princess Elindra. She was the public face of the Dominion's next generation, photographed at every summit and ceremony for the past decade. The images did not prepare you for the reality of her. She was seated on a chair that was not quite a throne. The actual throne was reserved for the sovereign, her father, who was by all accounts dying slowly of something the Vel called the long diminishment and humans called systemic organ failure. The chair she occupied was carved from the same white composite as the walls, shaped to suggest authority without demanding it. She wore formal court dress, layers of deep violet and silver that moved like liquid when she breathed, and around her neck the great seal of the Dominion on a chain that probably weighed more than Marcus's entire diplomatic kit. She was watching him with those pale gold eyes that Vel had, irises the color of old sunlight, pupils that contracted to thin horizontal lines in bright light. Her face was angular and still in the way that Vel faces were still, the kind of stillness that came not from lack of expression, but from absolute control over every expression. She looked, Marcus thought, like someone sitting in a room they did not choose to be in, doing a thing they had not chosen to do, waiting to see what the universe intended to make of the situation. He understood exactly how she felt. He stopped at the appropriate distance, inclined his head at the angle that indicated equal to equal respect in the third court dialect, and said, in formal Vel, "Your Radiance, I am Marcus Vale, ambassador of Earth and the allied human territories. I come without armor and without weapons as custom requires." There was a long pause. The court functionaries along the walls, there were perhaps 30 of them, in various grades of ceremonial dress, were absolutely still. Marcus had the clear impression that nobody breathed. Elindra said, in accented but clear English, "You're smaller than I expected." It was not what the court protocol demanded. It was absolutely not what 30 frozen functionaries had braced to hear. Marcus could feel the ripple of controlled alarm move through the room like a wave. He said, "So are you actually. The official portraits add about 6 inches. Another pause, longer. Then in the corner of her right eye, something happened. It was barely visible. If Marcus hadn't spent years learning to read Vel microexpressions, he would have missed it entirely. It was the faintest possible contraction of the muscles around her eye, the Vel equivalent of a suppressed laugh. She said back in formal Vel, "Ambassador Vale, you are welcome to the court of the Vel Dominion. The rites of binding will occur in 17 of your days. Until that time, you will be given quarters in the inner court and access to all non-restricted areas of the sovereign ring." "I'm grateful for your hospitality," Marcus said, in formal Vel, and meant neither word. He was assigned quarters that were, objectively speaking, extraordinary. 6 rooms of carved white composite with ceilings that glowed softly and floors that were warm to the touch. A bathing chamber with water that ran at any temperature he specified. A library terminal loaded with the complete archive of the Vel public record, 30,000 years of literature and history and art, more than any human institution had ever accessed in one place. He sat on the sleeping platform for a while in the dark and ran through what he knew. The Vel Dominion ruled 43 star systems. Human space touched the edge of Vel territory at 11 points. The treaty that protected those 11 contact zones was due for renewal in 8 months. The sovereign was dying. Elindra would inherit within the year. The Dominion's hardline faction, the Velkari, the old blood, the ones who had opposed human expansion since first contact, had been gaining influence at court for the past 3 years. They wanted to let the treaties lapse. They wanted to renegotiate from a position of complete dominance, or not at all. The marriage was not a gesture of goodwill. Marcus understood that clearly. The marriage was a leash. The Velkhari expected to control whoever held Elindra's hand. They had chosen a human because a human would be isolated, dependent, ignorant, and grateful. A human husband would be a hostage dressed in diplomatic clothing, and the clothing was the point. Earth couldn't publicly object to a treaty marriage without appearing to reject the peace it claimed to want. It was, Marcus thought, a very elegant trap. He had been in elegant traps before. On Kepler 442b, a mining shaft had collapsed around him, and he'd been alone in the dark for 19 hours with a failing suit light and 11 centimeters of breathable airspace above a rising water line. He had gotten out. He hadn't gotten out by panicking or by waiting to be rescued. He'd gotten out by being very quiet, very still, and very precise about what he did with the resources he had. He pulled out his personal tablet, personal, not diplomatic, outside Dominion monitoring protocols, and started making notes. On the morning of the third day, he requested a meeting with the court's senior archivist. The archivist was a Vel named Thesivorn, 700 years old and small for his kind, which still made him 6.5 feet tall. He had the slightly translucent skin of very old Vel, and he looked at Marcus with the particular expression of someone who had lived long enough that very little surprised him, but who was currently experiencing something that might qualify as mild surprise. An ambassador, Thesivorn said, who requests access to the restricted historical archive. An ambassador who is going to be part of this institution for a very long time, Marcus said, and who would like to understand it. The restricted archive, Thesivorn repeated. Not the ceremonial history, not the trade records, the restricted archive. I understand what I said. There was a pause. Thesivorn studied him the way the honor guard had studied him on the docking corridor, that same precise, unhurried assessment. Then he said, "What specifically are you looking for?" The Velkhari faction's founding documents, the legal basis of the sovereign's binding authority, the historical record of every non-Vel individual who has held a position in the inner court, going back as far as records exist. Another long pause. May I ask why? Because, Marcus said, I'm about to marry into one of the most powerful institutions in the known galaxy, and I intend to understand exactly what I am becoming part of. Thesivorn looked at him for a long moment. Then he said, the last human who visited this archive came as part of a diplomatic delegation 14 years ago. He requested the public tourism packet and spent most of his time looking at the ceremonial armor display. I know, Marcus said. His name was Delegate Ferris. I read his report. He described the court as impressive but impenetrable. I disagree with his conclusion. Thesivorn said nothing for another moment. Then he turned and walked toward the archive doors, and Marcus followed. He spent 6 hours in the archive on that first visit. He went back every day after that. The thing about the Vel that most human analysts missed, he'd noted it in his own reports, but nobody senior had ever seemed to fully absorb it, was that their political structures were not fundamentally different from human ones. The names were different. The timescales were different. Vel political cycles ran in centuries, not years. But the underlying dynamics were the same. Factions, alliances, debts, obligations, the long ledger of who owed what to whom and the constant, delicate management of which debts were being called in. The Vel were not alien in their ambition or their fear. They were just old at it. Old enough that the mechanisms were layered under 11,000 years of ceremony and tradition, and the kind of institutional memory that most human civilizations could barely imagine. But mechanisms were mechanisms, and Marcus was very good at mechanisms. On the 7th day, Elindra came to find him in the archive. He heard her coming, the soft chime of her court dress against the floor, the barely there sound of the honor guard's footsteps hanging back at the archive threshold. He did not look up from the document he was reading. which was a 300-year-old legal brief on the limits of the sovereign's binding authority in matters of treaty negotiation. She stopped across the reading table from him. After a moment she said in English, "You read Old Vel's script." Slowly, he said, "I'm working on it. That document is restricted to members of the sovereign's direct household. Thessivorn granted me access." "Thessivorn does not have the authority to grant access to," she stopped. "Read the page heading. How did you convince him?" "I asked him a question he'd been wanting someone to ask for approximately 400 years. Marcus looked up. "I asked him what he thought the Velkhari Founding Council had actually intended versus what they claimed to have intended. He talked for 40 minutes. Then he gave me his access codes." Elindra looked at him for a long moment. Then she sat down across from him, which was not, he was fairly certain, what she had come here to do. "You are not what the Velkhari expected," she said. "No. They expected someone who would be manageable." "I know." She was quiet for a moment. In the pale light of the archive, the gold of her irises was very clear. She had the court stillness in her face, the absolute control, but her hands on the table were not quite still. One finger was making a very slight tapping motion against the surface, barely perceptible, the Vel equivalent of a nervous gesture. She said, "They chose you specifically. They reviewed 47 human diplomatic candidates. They chose you because your psychological profile indicated adaptability without assertion. They interpreted adaptable as compliant." "I noticed that interpretation error," Marcus said. "I'm willing to let them keep it for a while." Another silence, longer. The finger stopped tapping. "For a while," she repeated. "Until I understand the leverage points well enough to use them." She looked at him, really looked, the way she had looked in the court of first meeting when he'd said she was smaller than the portrait suggested, and she'd almost laughed. It was the look of someone recalibrating. "You are planning something," she said. "I'm planning many things. Most of them require information I don't have yet. Some of them require allies I haven't found yet." He paused. "Some of them might require you." She said nothing. Her finger was still. He said, "I am not going to be a hostage, your radiance. I'm going to be your husband. Those are two very different things, and I think you understand the difference as well as I do. The Velkhari want to control you through me. I have no interest in controlling you. I have significant interest in making sure they fail." She was quiet for a very long time. Then she said, "The ceremony is in 10 days. "Yes. After the ceremony, you will have the formal status of consort of the Dominion seat. It is not a position of significant political power, as written." "As written," Marcus agreed. Her eyes were very steady on his. "The consort historically has access to all court sessions as an observer, no voting authority, no formal voice in proceedings." "Also as written." "Observers," she said, "are frequently underestimated." "I've noticed that." Something shifted in her face. Not a smile. Vel didn't smile the way humans did, the mouth curve that was a reflex of pleasure or amusement, but a particular quality of attention that he was beginning to understand as the Vel equivalent. "I am going to need to think about this conversation," she said. "Take whatever time you need," Marcus said. "I'll be here." She left the archive the way she'd come in, with the honor guard falling in silently behind her. Marcus went back to his document. He hummed very quietly something his mother had sung, an old earth tune, no particular meaning. He hummed it when he was working through a problem. He was working through several. On the 9th day, 3 members of the Velkhari approached him in the garden corridor. The garden corridor was one of the inner court's ceremonial spaces, a long passageway where the composite walls had been inlaid with living Vel plant life, things that were not quite trees and not quite coral, growing in slow spirals toward the light columns overhead. Marcus walked there in the mornings because the light was good, and because it was quiet. The three Velkhari were senior members of the faction. He recognized them from his research. Counselor Meath, who controlled the Treaty Review Committee. High Prefect Vasha, whose family had served in the Dominion administration for 6,000 years. And Lord Advocate Drain, who was the Velkhari's primary legal instrument and who had drafted, according to archive records Marcus had read 2 days ago, the specific legal framework that had made the marriage treaty possible. They were dressed in the dark gray of formal court business, not the ceremonial silver of the Velkhari's public identity, and they came at him from 3 points of the corridor in a pattern that was technically a casual convergence and actually a very old piece of social pressure. Marcus stopped walking. He stood with his hands loose at his sides and waited. Meath spoke first. Ambassador Vale. We had hoped to have a private conversation before the ceremonies. Of course, Marcus said. You've been spending a great deal of time in the archive. I find it fascinating. Vasha said, a human finding 11,000 years of Vel history fascinating is unusual. I'm an unusual human. Drain spoke for the first time. His voice was the deep resonance of very old Vel, and he spoke with the precision of someone who had spent millennia choosing words with legal weight. The position of consort carries significant ceremonial obligation. We would not want you to find yourself overwhelmed by the complexity of court life. I appreciate your concern, Marcus said. The court has many factions, Drain continued. Many old alliances, old debts. It can be confusing for someone new to the structures. It would be natural for a consort to rely on guidance from those who understand the court well. Guidance, Marcus said. Orientation, assistance. There are those who would be glad to help you navigate the intricacies. Marcus looked at all three of them in turn. He had the sense, as he often had in negotiations, of being in 2 conversations at once, the spoken one and the real one running underneath it. In the spoken conversation, they were offering friendly assistance to an overwhelmed foreigner. In the real one, they were telling him that the leash existed, that they held it, and that he should stop spending time in archives and start spending time learning which hand to eat from. He said, I spent 19 hours trapped in a collapsed mining shaft on Kepler 442b, no light, rising water, failing oxygen recycler. The rescue team didn't reach me for 11 hours after I had already gotten myself out. He paused. I don't overwhelm easily. The 3 of them looked at him. He said pleasantly, but I do appreciate the offer. I'll keep it in mind if I need orientation. He walked away down the garden corridor. He did not look back. He was humming. The ceremony was on the 17th day. It took 4 hours. There were aspects of it that were extraordinarily beautiful. The Velthon, the binding light, which was some form of bioluminescent technology Marcus hadn't fully decoded yet. A column of soft gold radiance that surrounded them both during the vows, warm and strange. There were aspects of it that were exhausting. The chanted recitation of the Vel lineage, which went back 40 generations and took approximately 90 minutes. There were aspects of it that were simply surreal, standing in the great court of an alien civilization that had ruled the galaxy before his species had learned to write, saying words in a language that was not his own that committed him to an institution he had not chosen, beside a woman he had known for 16 days. Elindra stood through all of it with the absolute stillness of someone who had been prepared for this their entire life. Her court dress was different from the violet and silver of their first meeting. Today it was white and deep gold, the sovereign colors, and the seal of the Dominion at her throat caught the binding light and scattered it in fragments across the ceiling of the court. When they said the final words, the human Val Marcus had spent 3 days learning to pronounce correctly in the old dialect, the one that meant I come without armor and I do not intend to leave. She looked at him. Not the assessing look, not the almost smile, something that was harder to read and that he filed away in the part of his mind that dealt with information he didn't have context for yet. Afterward, at the court reception, he was introduced to the full Dominion administration. Ministers, prefects, commanders of the Dominion fleet, the heads of the great Vel houses, the senior representatives of the 43 member systems. It took 3 hours. He spoke to each of them in Vel, remembered every name, asked each one a question that demonstrated he had read their official record and understood their domain. He could feel the Velkari watching him from the far end of the room, recalibrating. Good. 3 weeks after the ceremony, the first test came. The Velkari called an emergency session of the Court Review Council. The stated subject was a review of the treaty renewal timeline with the human territories. The actual subject, which Marcus had learned about through Thessivorn, who had, over the past several weeks, become something approaching a reluctant ally, was a motion to reclassify 3 of the 11 human contact zones as unregulated transitional territory, which was a legal designation that would, in practice, remove them from treaty protection entirely. As consort, Marcus had observer status at the council session. He sat in the observer's position, a carved seat to the left of the sovereign's empty throne, which was occupied by Elindra in her capacity as the sovereign's voice during his illness, and he watched. The motion was introduced by Drain with 40 minutes of precisely calibrated legal language. Marcus listened to every word. He had read every precedent Drain cited. He had read several that Drain did not cite. When Drain finished, the council moved to discussion. One by one, the Velkari members spoke in support. The opposition members, there were 7 of them, significantly outnumbered, raised procedural objections that were methodically dismantled. Marcus watched the room. He was watching the way he had watched that collapsing mining shaft for 19 hours. Calm, precise, identifying resources. 7 opposition members, 12 Velkari members, 6 members from the outer systems, the 43 member worlds that were not Velkari aligned, but that had their own calculations about human expansion. The outer system members had said nothing yet. Elindra presided. She was required, by the court rules Drain himself had written, to allow the session to proceed to a vote without interference from the sovereign's voice, unless a procedural error was identified. The discussion ran for 2 hours. Marcus did not speak. Observers did not speak. That was the rule. What observers could do, apparently, he had found this in a 600-year-old procedural addendum that had never been repealed, only forgotten, was submit a written question to the council through the sovereign's voice, for the sovereign's voice to read aloud if she chose. He wrote the question on a piece of ceremonial paper, the kind available at the observer's station, which he suspected no one had used in centuries, and passed it to Elindra's attendant. The attendant, visibly uncertain about this, passed it to Elindra. She read it, a pause, then she read it again. Her face was absolutely still. Then she said, in formal court tones, "The council will hear a question from the observer's position, submitted by right of the 600-year procedural addendum, Article 7. The room went very quiet. She read, "Under the founding charter of the Dominion Treaty System, any reclassification of territory that was established under a previous sovereign's direct mandate requires the sitting sovereign's explicit ratification. The territories in question were established by direct mandate of Sovereign Velthon IV, 1100 years ago. The sovereign is not present, who authorized this session to proceed without the required ratification." The silence continued. Drain said, "That addendum has not been invoked in 600 years," Elindra said. "Correct. It has also not been repealed. Lord Advocate Drain, you drafted the current court procedural code. Do you dispute the addendum's validity?" A very long pause. Drain could not dispute the addendum's validity. He had drafted the procedural code specifically to preserve all historical precedent, because that preservation had served the Valkyries' purposes in a dozen other cases. He had, in building his careful legal architecture, left this particular window open. The session was suspended pending the sovereign's ratification, which, given the state of the sovereign's health, was not going to be obtained in any practical time frame. The three contact zones stayed protected. Walking back from the council chamber, with the honor guard at their appropriate distance behind them and the corridor ahead of them empty, Elindra said very quietly in English, "Where did you find that addendum?" "Archive," Marcus said. "No one has found that addendum in 600 years. No one spent 6 hours a day in the archive for 2 weeks with a specific question in mind." She walked for a moment in silence. "What was the question?" "What is the oldest piece of Vel law that has never been repealed, and that could block a procedural end run on treaty territory?" She stopped walking, he stopped too. She said, "You came here knowing they were going to do this." "I came here knowing they were going to do something. I didn't know exactly what. I spent the first 2 weeks figuring out exactly what." He paused. "The archive is very comprehensive." She was looking at him the way she had looked at him that first morning in the archive, when she'd come to find him and ended up sitting down across the table and not leaving for 2 hours. But the look was different now. There was something in it that was harder to parse. She said, "They are going to try again." "Yes. Next time, they will use a session that doesn't have the founding charter limitation." "Yes, I know which session. I have 3 options prepared for blocking it, depending on which procedural angle they use." He paused. "I also have 2 of the Outer System Council members who are willing to raise concerns about the long-term precedent implications of the reclassification framework. They're not ideologically opposed to the Valkyrie. They're concerned about what the framework would mean for their own territory classifications if it succeeded." Another very long pause. "You've been meeting with the Outer System Council members." "I've been having conversations. Observers are allowed to have conversations. It's not in any procedural code, but it's also not prohibited." She said, "Lord Advocate Drain is going to be furious." "Yes," Marcus said. "But he's going to be furious while trying to find a legal framework that works around a 600-year-old addendum that he himself preserved, and he's going to be doing it with the knowledge that the observer's position has someone in it who has read every addendum in the archive. That is going to take time. Time is useful." He started walking again. After a moment, she walked with him. She said quietly, "Why?" He didn't ask what she meant. "Because 17 human colonies depend on those contact zone treaties. Because my job as the only human diplomat in this building is to protect human interests. Because," he paused and was honest, "I am very bad at being managed, and the Valkyrie have been doing exactly that, and I find it objectionable." "Those are all true," she said. "Are there other reasons?" He walked for a moment. "You are not what they made you out to be in the treaty documents either," he said finally. "They described the princess as the mechanism of the marriage agreement. They didn't describe a person who reads English in private and speaks it to a stranger at a formal reception because she's curious about what he'll say back." She said nothing. They turned a corner into the garden corridor, where the not tree, not coral things grew toward the light columns in their slow spirals. She said, "I learned English because I was curious. My father's advisors thought it was unnecessary. The Valkyrie thought it was inappropriate, learning a lesser language. I learned it anyway." "I know," Marcus said. "I read your educational record." She stopped again. "You read my educational record?" "It's in the archive, publicly available section." He kept his voice neutral. "It was very interesting." A pause, then quietly, "What did you find interesting?" "You were studying comparative political philosophy at 17. You wrote a thesis on the failure modes of long-duration civilizations. Your advisor gave it an excellent mark and recommended against circulating it, because your conclusions about institutional rigidity were, his words, provocative. She was very still. I found it in the archive. Your advisor filed a copy. He paused. You argued that the most dangerous failure mode for any long-duration civilization was the point at which self-preservation of structure became indistinguishable from the preservation of power for its own sake, that the institutions most likely to cause the collapse they were designed to prevent were the ones that had existed so long they had forgotten their original purpose. Another pause. I thought it was correct. She turned to face him. There in the garden corridor, with the soft light coming down through the apertures and the slow living things growing on the walls. Her face was not still, or rather, it was still in the way that water becomes still when the thing moving through it has already passed, the surface settling over something that has already changed. She said, I wrote that at 17. Yes. The Velkhari have existed for 4,000 years. My father's administration has worked with them for his entire reign. The treaty system they support has kept the Dominion stable for 2,000 years, Marcus said, and has also, as your thesis noted, calcified in ways that make it increasingly inflexible in response to changing conditions, such as, for example, the emergence of a technologically capable species in adjacent space that does not fit the historical framework. She was quiet. He said, You were right at 17. You are presumably still right. The question is what to do about it. The garden corridor was empty of guards for approximately 30 meters in either direction. He was aware of that. He was also aware that she was aware of it, that she had chosen this corridor for this conversation at this moment. She said, The Velkhari believe they are saving the Dominion. I know, they are also wrong, but more immediately, they are trying to dismantle 11 contact zones that protect 43 million humans, and I'm not going to let them do that. He paused. What I could use is someone who has the legal authority to convene a review of the treaty system and who is also, in 10 months, going to be the sovereign. A very long pause. That is a very large ask, she said. I know. The Velkhari have significant control over the succession process, if I move against them openly. Not openly, Marcus said. Not yet. Not until the succession is secure and the sovereign's ratification requirement gives us the legal shelter to hold the existing treaties through the transition. I'm not asking for open conflict. I'm asking for time. She looked at him for a very long moment. Then she said, in formal vel, the cadence of a court declaration. The consort has observer status at all court sessions. Yes, Marcus said in English. And the consort is not subject to Velkhari procedural restrictions, as the consort's position was established by direct sovereign mandate rather than council agreement. I read that in the archive. The consort is, by historical precedent, entitled to petition the sovereign directly on matters of treaty concern, bypassing the council entirely. He was quiet. I did not know that, he said very carefully. It has not been done in 3,000 years. The last consort to do it was a non-Vel member of the outer house, who petitioned the sovereign to block the annexation of her home system. She paused. She succeeded. He thought about the archive. About Thessivorn, who had given him access codes and who had been wanting, for 400 years, for someone to ask the right questions. About the 600-year procedural addendum that Drain had preserved. About all the old machinery sitting in that building, layers and layers of it, 11,000 years deep. You've been in the archive too, he said. I have been in the archive my entire life, she said. I simply did not know until recently what I was looking for. He looked at her in the garden corridor with the soft falling light. He thought about a woman who had learned a lesser language because she was curious about what it contained, who had written a correct thesis at 17 and been advised not to circulate it, who had sat across a reading table from a stranger and not left for 2 hours. He thought about the trap, the elegant, careful trap that the Velkhari had built. A human husband, isolated, dependent, ignorant, grateful, a leash dressed in ceremonial clothing. He said, "I think they misread us both." She said, "Yes." And then very quietly, something that might have been amusement in another register, that was their mistake. The Velkhari made their next move 6 weeks later. It came through the succession committee, a motion to formalize the sovereign's diminished capacity and transfer executive authority to a regency council during the transition period. The regency council, as proposed, would consist of 7 members, 5 of whom were Velkhari aligned. A regency council with executive authority could ratify the treaty reclassification. A regency council with executive authority could restructure the contact zone agreements before Elindra formally ascended. A regency council with executive authority could, in practice, render the ascending sovereign's first years largely ceremonial. The motion was scheduled to come before the full court in 12 days. Marcus spent 4 days in the archive. On the 5th day, he petitioned the sovereign directly. The petition process was archaic. It involved a physical document, not a digital submission, written in the oldest Vel script and delivered by hand to the sovereign's private chamber. Marcus had spent 2 nights learning the script well enough to write it. Thesivorn had helped, which had required a 4-hour conversation about the historical significance of what Marcus was attempting and what it might mean if it worked. Thesivorn had ultimately helped because he was 700 years old and had seen 11,000 years of history in that archive and was, Marcus thought, someone who had been quietly hoping for a long time that someone would remember that the old machinery still ran. The sovereign received him. He was old in the way that dying things are old, present and not quite present, the body still in the space but some essential attention already drawn toward the door. But his eyes were clear, and they were gold like Elindra's, and he looked at Marcus for a long time. Marcus said in the old dialect, "Sovereign, I come without armor, I do not intend to leave." The sovereign said, in a voice like deep water running over stone, "You said those words at the binding ceremony." "Yes, sovereign, I meant them." A pause. "What do you ask?" "The consort's right of direct petition. I ask the sovereign to issue a ratification order that binds all existing contact zone treaties through the full succession period, requiring any modification to wait for the ascending sovereign's personal review." A long silence. "The Velkhari," the sovereign said. "Yes, sovereign. They will dispute it. Lord Advocate Drain will dispute it. He will find that the founding charter's succession provisions give the sitting sovereign unilateral ratification authority in the 90 days preceding the succession. He will find that because I found it, and I believe his legal team has not yet found it, because it was in a commentary document filed with the archive 600 years ago, and the filing system is not optimally organized." Another silence. Then, very quietly, the sovereign said, "You are not what they told me you would be." "No, sovereign. They described you as adaptable." "I am adaptable," Marcus said. "They failed to consider what I might adapt to." The sovereign was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "My daughter, what does she think of this petition?" Marcus said, "I believe she would support it, but the petition is mine, sovereign. I make it on my own authority as consort. I am not here as her instrument." The sovereign looked at him. Then slowly he said, "She found it first, didn't she? The founding charter succession provision." Marcus was quiet for a moment. "Yes, sovereign," he said, "she did." Something happened in the old sovereign's face. It was the same thing that had happened in Elindra's face in the garden corridor, the settling of a surface over something that had already changed. But in the sovereign's face it was older and larger, the settling of a very long patience that had been waiting for the right moment. He said, "My daughter has been right about many things since she was 17 years old. She has been told repeatedly that she was wrong." "Yes, Sovereign. That will not serve the Dominion well in the coming century." "No, Sovereign, it will not." The Sovereign signed the ratification order. The Velkhari challenged it. Of course they did. Drain brought a legal motion to the full court within 48 hours, arguing procedural overreach. The argument was technically sophisticated and legally creative, and it ran directly into the founding charter succession provision, which Marcus had submitted as a companion document to the ratification order, along with 17 supporting precedents from the archive. Thesivorn's signed attestation of the document's authenticity, and a formal legal brief that had taken him 4 nights to write, and that Elindra had reviewed and marked up in the margins with a precision that suggested she had been thinking about exactly this kind of document for a long time. The motion failed. The contact zones were protected. The succession process moved forward under the ratified framework. 4 months later, when the sovereign died gently in his chambers with his daughter present and his court assembled, Elindra ascended as sovereign of the Vel Dominion. The ceremony took 6 hours. Marcus stood at her right side in the formal consort position. He wore the diplomatic gray with the blue piping. He did not wear the elaborate ceremonial court dress that the Velkhari had quietly arranged to be presented to him, with its layers of compliant symbolism and its implication that the consort was an ornament of the sovereign's court. He wore what he was, a diplomat from Earth, standing in a court that was not his, doing a job he had not chosen but that he had decided, somewhere between the archive and the garden corridor, and a 4-hour conversation with a 700-year-old archivist, to do properly. Elindra's face during the ceremony was still, the court's stillness, the total control. But at one point, when the binding light came down around them both as it had at the wedding ceremony and her eyes turned to find his, she looked at him the way she had looked at him in the garden corridor, and he understood it now. It was the look of someone who had been prepared their whole life to do something alone, and had discovered with some surprise that they weren't. After the ceremony at the formal reception, Counselor Meath approached him, alone, without Vasha or Drain. Meath was older than the others, one of the genuinely ancient Vel, his skin so translucent it was nearly luminous, his eyes very pale. He said, "Consort Vale, you have had an eventful first season." "It's been interesting," Marcus said. "The Velkhari," Meath said carefully, "are not your enemies." "I know. We serve the Dominion. We have served the Dominion for 4,000 years. "I know," Marcus said. "Your founding documents are very clear about that. I read them in the archive." He paused. "I also read the commentary documents filed by the Velkhari's Second Council, approximately 1100 years after the founding, discussing the strategic value of the treaty system. The original founders wanted a stable framework for governing a diverse coalition. The Second Council wanted a framework that preserved Vel authority specifically. The subsequent councils were working from the Second Council's interpretation, not the founders." He let that land. "I'm not sure the current Velkhari are still serving what they think they're serving." Meath was quiet for a long time. "That is," he said finally, "a significant claim." "It is," Marcus said. "It is also in your own archive." Another silence. Meath looked at him with those ancient pale eyes. "What do you want, Consort Vale?" "What I've always wanted," Marcus said. "A treaty system that actually works, one that protects human space and is worth protecting because it's genuinely mutual, one that the Velkhari help build because they understand what the founders intended, not because they're defending what the Second Council accumulated." He paused. "That's a bigger project. It takes longer. It requires conversations rather than legal motions." He looked at Meath steadily. "I have time." Meath looked at him for a long moment. Then he said very quietly, "You are very strange for a human." "So I've been told," Marcus said. "I've found it useful." He walked away to find his wife. She was across the room, in the deep gold of the sovereign's regalia, surrounded by the heads of the outer system delegations who had traveled to witness the succession. She was listening to a delegation head from one of the far systems, small, intensely colored beings who communicated partially in light spectrum shifts, with the particular quality of attention that Marcus had learned to recognize as genuine interest rather than diplomatic courtesy. He stood at the edge of the room and watched her for a moment. He thought about the mining shaft, the dark and the water, and the 11 seconds of assessment before you touched anything. He thought about Thessivorn, who had been waiting 400 years for someone to ask the right questions. He thought about a 600-year-old addendum in a badly organized filing system, and a 300-year-old legal brief on the limits of binding authority, and a 17-year-old thesis about institutional rigidity that had been advised not to circulate. He thought about elegant traps, and the thing about elegant traps, which was that they were built by people who had a very specific model of what they had trapped, and the model was almost always incomplete. Elindra looked up from the outer system delegation and found him across the room. He raised his glass very slightly, the Vel ceremonial cup, something amber and warm that tasted nothing like any earth drink he knew, and that he had grown to like over the past months. She inclined her head, the angle that meant equal to equal in the third court dialect. He thought, 11 human contact zones protected, 17 colonies secure, 1 treaty ratification that would take the Velkari's legal team approximately 2 years to work around, by which time the new sovereign would have the full authority of her position, and the treaty review process would be running on her terms. And across the room, a sovereign who had learned a lesser language because she was curious, who had written a correct thesis at 17, who had been in the archive her whole life looking for the right questions, who had found one set of them and had been finding her way to the rest. He hummed very quietly something his mother had sung. Just a few notes, barely audible under the sound of the reception. An old earth tune, no particular words, just the rhythm of it, the particular human habit of putting music into silence because silence is heavy and music is not. He had been in bad places before, hostile environments, the kind of places that were designed, by geology, by bureaucracy, by the careful architecture of people who wanted you manageable, to make you small and afraid and grateful for whatever you were given. He had never stayed small. The Vel Dominion was 11,000 years old, and it had never, in all that time, had a human anywhere near its center. It had made certain assumptions about what that would mean. It had built certain structures around those assumptions. It had filed its legal precedents, and maintained its ceremonial codes, and preserved its founding documents in an archive that no one had read all the way through in 600 years. Marcus Vale had read it. He finished his drink, set the cup down on the tray of a passing attendant, and walked across the room to stand at the right side of the sovereign of the Vel Dominion, where he belonged.